All right, well, we'll get into it. We'll jump right in. We're talking about the pack test today. We're going to answer the question, do we need to reassess the pack test? Which I'm excited to get to that. We'll get to that question and kind of share our thoughts at the end. But yeah, we're going to do a deep dive on where the pack test came from, the history of the pack test, and even going back before the pack test was really a thing, going all the way back to like the 60s and the 70s and the step test. So I'm excited to kind of dig into the history. I know not everyone loves this stuff as much as like you and me. So they might not nerd out about the history of, physiology testing and everything like we do, but that's okay. I still think it's cool to understand, this test that you have to do every year to get your red card and go out on the fire line that tens of thousands of firefighters take every single year. It's kind of cool to really know like where it came from, why it even started in the first place, why it is how it is. Why is it 45 minutes? Why is it 3 miles? And what that's actually measuring and how that relates to what's been measured on the fire line. So that's going to be kind of the idea. And then, we'll talk a little bit about the flaws of the pack test, which there's multiple. There's a lot. I don't want this to turn into just a bashing of the pack test episode, but I know I'll say this before we kind of dig into the history. I know I like to put out some funny clips and things like that on the internet or on my social media about the pack test. Which, did you see my one post about the job versus the fitness test reel I had like a month
I
ago?
don't think so. Not the most recent one.
That's my favorite post I've ever made of all time. And if you haven't seen it, I'll explain it, but it just doesn't do it justice. You gotta watch it to get the full comedic effect. But it's like the first couple clips are taken from the movie Hot Shot, so they're like super badass visuals showing like crazy flame lengths, going direct, cutting, swamping, like throwing brush, and then I put a song in the background. It's like a badass rock song from the Friday Night Lights movie when they're coming out of the tunnel for the state championship game. So it's like the whole point I'm trying to show, like, man, this job is badass. It's hardcore. And then right in the middle of that highlight, it cuts to an old clip that I found on like 1990s aerobic power walking. And it shows this dude. This guy looks like Seinfeld because it's like in the 90s. He's got like short shorts and he's just like power walking to like this like piano song in the background, and the voiceover is him talking about like this aerobic dance walk is elegant and rhythmic, and he's like, dude, just swinging his hips so much, and I'm like, that's the job and this is the fitness test. And dude, it's so funny. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I made myself die laughing when I was editing it, and then every time I watch it, it's just hilarious. And it's one of my most popular reels. I think it's like 3,000 people have shared it just on Instagram alone. So all that to say, I know I can be a tough critic on the pack test at times, but we'll get into my critiques, your critiques. We'll also get into like the good aspects of the pack test, why it is how it is, and why that's a good thing. Because there are a lot of good aspects of the pack test, and personally, I don't think it needs to go away anytime soon. But we're gonna talk about that more in the next episode. So this is gonna be a part two series essentially. So part one, we're just kind of talking about the pack test. Part two, we're gonna talk about potential other fitness tests that we can implement, namely type 1 fitness test, which is one that we created at Rugged Athlete to test more of the higher demands of the fire line. So we'll get into that on part two and just kind of talk about fitness assessments in more detail, in more general outside of the pack test. So we'll talk about that in part two. Be sure to check that out once that goes. But yeah, let's get into the pack test. I want to go over the history of it, but first, I'm curious, what was your experience the first time that you took the pack test? How did that go for you? Your first time ever?
Yeah, first time ever. It was awkward. I feel like it was more awkward than anything, and it's because my fitness was fairly high. Like honestly, I breezed through it. I don't think my heart rate got past like 75% of my max the whole time. Pretty easy on the cardiovascular demand. But of course, you're like the ego comes into play. The top people start hauling ass out of the
Yeah.
gate, and you want to like keep up. So just from never having done that test before, the flat terrain honestly sucked. It was the worst part about it. Like just having to do that speed walk, the elegant aerobic dance,
Yeah.
and
You got to use your hips,
just
man.
yeah, man. It was like it made me realize I never want to get into speed walking whoever does the Olympic speed walking just built different. Their hips, their low back, just wow. I could never imagine doing that for 26 miles. So I hated it. I just really did not like. We'll get into the pros and cons, but from my subjective opinion and coming from the background that I was in, I was thinking the whole time, this is bullshit. Like I was like, I don't want to be doing this. But
Yeah.
of course,
It's a
I
long
think
45 minutes.
it was just because I was going so like, dude, you're just going the stride rate, the stride length. It's just too much. I ended up just basically like kind of faking it and jogging like everybody does, just to make it like more efficient. It's like, dude, I'm gonna hurt myself trying to speed walk this thing. I'm jogging. Fuck this.
Dude, we got to
That was my
revoke your red card. You
experience.
can't be cheating the pack test.
Dude, take it off. I don't give. I'm out this season anyways. Fucking take it off my red card. I'm claiming it right now. I ran. Everybody runs. They're lying if they don't. If you're in the front and you're doing it, you're fucking running. Call it what it is.
All right, guys, real quick, we're going to pause because I got to tell you about today's sponsor for this episode, and that is Ready Bar. Ready Bar is a meal replacement bar. It's an energy bar. It's a protein bar. It's all of these things combined into one. They've got 4 different flavors. They've got the OG, which is PB&J. They've got oatmeal cream, which is my favorite. That one is actually insanely good. They have espresso mocha, which I think there's even a little bit of caffeine in there, if I remember right, which is awesome. And then chocolate peanut caramel. 4 good flavors. The macros on these things are legit. You've got 500 calories, 72 grams of carbs. Only 11 of those are coming from sugar. So most of those carbs are coming from oats. So you're getting a solid complex carb source. Got 19 grams of fat and 25 grams of protein. Not to mention there's anywhere between 4 and 500 milligrams of sodium depending on the flavor of bar you get. And there's 15 grams of dietary fiber. That's insanely good. I don't think y'all realize this. So we're talking about high protein, high fiber, high complex carbs, all things that from my experience on the fire line, you can really use. Plus the calories, especially if you have a busy assignment and you're burning through a ton of calories. This thing is great to keep in your pack. It's not covered in chocolate, so it's not going to melt when it gets in your pack. Like pretty much every other protein bar that you try to eat that doesn't taste like friggin' cardboard or chalk. This thing is good. So head over to getreadybar.com. Support the people that support us. It means a lot. All right, let's get back to the show. Dude, my first time, I didn't run because I have integrity, but I'm just playing. But I treated it like a race. I was like, I've got this. It was my first day, like first day there. So in the morning, so I literally just showed up, didn't know anybody, and there's this big group of dudes, and I'm looking around. Of course, my ego's up there too. I'm like trying to prove myself, eyeing everybody, like who's gonna be my competition. And I'm coming straight from strength and conditioning, so I'm fit. I'm like, dude, I'm setting the tone morning of day 1, and I'm setting a world record on this pack test. And obviously I didn't. Who knows? That's stupid to even think about that. But dude, I was like, I'm going all out, and yeah, I was doing it, and I'm just like, this is awkward is the perfect word. Like, got done with that, and then I mean, it wasn't hard because, like I said, and like you were saying, came in with high levels of fitness, so the test was easy. But I just remember when I was doing it, I was so like, I was taking a race approach, which is knowing what the pack test is now from all the studying and everything, and just from hearing Dr. Ruby say however many times I've heard him say it, he's like, don't go faster. You don't get extra points. You don't get extra money. There's no bonus credit. You're supposed to do it in 45 minutes, which, yeah, we'll talk about that and kind of the pros versus the cons. I'm excited to, last thing before we get into the history, I'm excited to hear a little bit about your master's thesis. So, because it's funny, and I just told you this too, when I was like doing research for this episode and trying to find articles and digging up as much information that I could, I see DeMoss on one of the article headlines. I was like, I know that name. That name sounds familiar. So we'll talk about that study too, because that's pretty cool. That it's kind of how you got involved with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, 100%. It's definitely the reason why I got into this field, or that thought of wildland was even sparked in my mind originally. So that is kind of a cool full circle moment for me to be here talking about it. But the big thing with that study is going to be more relevant for the conversation in the middle when we talk about additional metrics that the pack hike test maybe could be utilizing, or other aerobic tests could be utilizing to get better, greater insight for cardiovascular health, resilience, VO2 max, all these things. So we'll get into that a little bit later in the conversation. But yeah, definitely just excited to be talking about assessments. I think it's a extremely valuable place in the field to be talking about this and giving people tools for, like, at the level of your crew, what assessments you could be doing, how you could be critiquing what you currently do and add layers to your existing programs. And the whole purpose of assessments is to provide meaning and relevancy and practicality to the job. So I think there's great things that the pack hike test does for that, and there's things that it doesn't. So just opening the conversation up that there's more to include, there's more to add, there's room to grow is really what we're here to do with this foundational episode. It's just give you the overview of what a physical assessment truly should consist of and what the benefits are of them.
Yeah, I'm excited for this episode because I love digging into the history of all this stuff, but I'm 10 times more excited for next episode because that's where we can really talk about like the practical kind of big picture behind the why and the how and the what of physical assessments, especially as they relate to a specific occupation like wildland fire that has very unique physical demands. So that's probably going to be a long episode. I'm just forecasting that right now. We're going to have to set aside a big block of time for that one. But why I want to talk about the history of the pack test is I do think that all of the context about, the last 6 to 7 decades of assessment, research, and development in wildland, it needs to be understood before we can even talk about kind of what would be a next step, or if we did reassess the pack test, what would that look like? If we want to have that conversation, which is the fun conversation, we need to understand the origin, we need to understand the context, the background, the barriers, the roadblocks, all of the stuff that's gotten us to this point. So let's get into that. We'll jump into the history a little bit. Where I'm pulling a lot of this stuff is from a few different places. One is this article I found this article actually a couple of years ago, but it's from 1997, and it was by the Oregon Department of Forestry, and they were essentially putting together like a big review on kind of the state of fitness assessments throughout all the different agencies. So they're looking at all the different federal agencies, all the different states. They were talking mostly about Oregon, Washington, and California in this paper, but they were kind of like, hey, this new pack test has been proposed as a potential change from the step test, which we'll get into all of that. And it's kind of interesting. I don't know if I just didn't read it clearly enough, or if they didn't even talk about it, but I didn't get a full understanding on if, like, at this point in time in the mid 90s, if everybody was doing the step test or if it was just like certain agencies were doing it. Because the message I got from reading this paper was that there wasn't a one full standard across the entire profession like there is now. Well, for the most part, there is now with the pack test and getting your red card. But it seemed like there was kind of like people were doing their own thing more so back then. And this paper was kind of like looking at what everyone was doing and seeing if the pack test was like a good blanket standard for kind of everybody. So that was 1997. I also found a couple different articles from like the late 90s, early 2000s, which were kind of like summarizing everything that happened in the mid 90s to go from the step test to the pack test. And I'm just kind of like breezing through this, but it's interesting kind of reading through and seeing how this all kind of started in 1994. 1994 is when Brian Sharkey, who was working at the University of Montana and had been working at Montana and studying this stuff since, as far as I know, 1965. 1994 is when they were like, hey, we need to reassess the step test. And that was after, 2 decades of doing the step test. I know you have some notes about the step test. I'll just cover what I have real quick, and then whatever you want to share about it, I'll let you hop in. But from what I've found, the research on all of this stuff started in 1965 with Brian Sharkey and trying to quantify the physical demands of fireline tasks. And that went on really consistently throughout the 60s and 70s from what I've kind of found. And just a quick interesting note too, if anyone listened to Dr. Brent Ruby's presentation during the Human Performance Summit that we did last month, he has some of that initial data that Brian Sharkey found. And he pointed out in his presentation, it was super cool. I think it's super cool because I'm a nerd. But he was like, this is showing, calories per hour for hiking, calories per hour for sawing a tree, digging line, using a shovel, because they used shovels a lot more back then. And they had it all typed out on a freaking typewriter. He's like, this is so old. All of their data was presented on typewriters. And basically what they found, or what Brian Sharkey found, was that all of this kind of equates out to an oxygen consumption of 22.5, and which equates to 7.5 calories burned per hour. And you can see all those different tasks that are listed out. They really are all kind of in that 6 to 8 calories per hour range. Some being a little bit less, some being a little bit more. But that's interesting. We'll get to why that 22.5 number is important for the pack test once we get kind of back around to it. But that's kind of where this started. And in 1975, after Brian Sharkey was trying to figure out a way to kind of measure all of those tasks and then find a way to measure that in the form of a fitness assessment, came up with the 5-minute pack test. So 1975, that was a long time ago. What do you have on the step test other than kind of like it was just a 5-minute step test for like all those fireline tasks?
So when we think about, let's paint a picture here. 5-minute step test. You get a bunch of firefighters going into a lab, going into a classroom, outside the station, whatever. You have them step up onto a little platform, step back down. You have them do it at a certain cadence. You time it. You take the heart rate at the very end of the test, and then you track how the heart rate comes down over the next few minutes. So that's what the step test looks like. Now, why are we doing that? What indicators are we getting from that test? What's the practicality? What's the meaning behind it? The big draw to the step test is aerobic or cardiorespiratory fitness. So if you strain somebody with some kind of exercise, some kind of push, you get their heart rate to go up and you see how it comes down. Greater endurance trained folks, greater cardiorespiratory fitness folks are going to go up to that demand, but it's going to be way less strain. So if you place that load on somebody and equate it across the board, they're all doing the same task. A really fit person, they're not even going to get close to their max heart rate. They shouldn't even be anywhere near that during the step test. But if you get somebody who's low fit, when they get up to that end of the step test, their heart rate's going to be proportionally much higher because they have a way less efficient cardiovascular system. They're having to pump out way more blood through a way higher heart rate to accommodate that demand. And then when they come back down, it's going to happen slower. So those are the two main things you get from the step test is how high do we push that ceiling for you at a standardized work rate? And then how well can you come back down and get back to normal? So when you think about wildland firefighting, that heart rate recovery piece, super important because your heart rate's going to get spiked over and over and over throughout the shift. And that typically is going to happen every single time you hike in. But what happens when you get to the job site? So those are like two things that you can kind of point to with why this test was serving a purpose for the time being. Because you're getting that general insight to general aerobic fitness, but there's a big limitation there in the fact that it's easy as fuck. There's absolutely zero push to this. It's not mimicking the demands of the job at all. So you kind of are having to extrapolate this. Your fitness is what's showing on this step test, and we're trying to relate that to Z. Like it's going from A to Z. There's way too much going on in between. So there's a bunch of pros to the step test and the fact that it's easy to execute, minimally invasive, very low risk, and just very time efficient.
Yeah, it's only
But
5 minutes.
yeah, so you can scale that. That's a real big bang for your buck in terms of like Forest Service. What can we do to get a general insight to aerobic fitness? Sure, let's throw this out, get some ideas, but what might have happened a ton is that you throw a pack on somebody and have them go cut line, and you see that their 45 VO2 max that you estimated that you got from the step test doesn't translate to the task itself. So that's the foundation of where this switch really came from. Because the pack test is a job-specific work capacity test. The step test is just a measure of cardiorespiratory fitness. You can get an idea for how well your body's ability to send blood out to its various systems and get that metabolic demand going. How more robust are you, generally speaking? But the field of wildland firefighting is so freaking niche that there's no way that a general test is going to be able to provide the insight for if you can do the metabolic demands, the cardiovascular demands during the job. So that's kind of the pros cons. And that's the whole conversation we're going to be repeating and just hitting the nail on the head with. There's no perfect test. There's zero assessment that is all of the things being met. It's pushes and pulls in each realm. But what the job specific work capacity test is it started to incorporate certain aspects of the job like hiking, like load carriage, like just the locomotive tasks that are a little bit more parallel to what we do, even though me and Austin just kind of blew that one out of the water saying it's awkward as shit and we hated it. So of course there's always those factors at play, but it started to spark the conversation with the fact that just assessing cardiovascular fitness is not simply enough for this population. You have to ingrain the mechanics, the mechanical strain imposed on people, the muscular fatigue, the muscular endurance. Those things also are just as a predictor of whether you can do the job as your general fitness, which is why you might have an elite cyclist that can hammer out that step test and barely go up 10 beats in their heart rate, but you go throw them in the scope of wildland firefighting and it's not going to look the same. So that's what I'll have to say about step test to where we're at in the introduction of the pack.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple good points we need to kind of go further on. One is just that discrepancy between more general just fitness, general aerobic capacity, and fitness that is a little bit more specific to the job. Why that's so important is because, well, especially if your fitness test or your physical assessment has any sort of punitive action behind it. So if this is determining your ability to be eligible for work, and if you fail, there's consequences and you can lose your job or not get hired, you have to be able to prove through very high level like validation sources that this test is an accurate measure of my ability to do this job. And there's so many countless examples across the military, across law enforcement, across fire departments of, lawsuits, people getting sued because they were able to prove in court that, I failed my run, but that doesn't mean I can't do the job. That happens so much. And so there has to be a really high level of validity behind these assessments. And I've got pulled it up here. This is part of that 1997 paper. And it's kind of saying that same thing. I'll just summarize it, but they're basically like, the rationale for a full replacement instead of a supplementary test to go alongside the step test is, I just lost it, where is it? The fact that no one can any longer defend the step test in court since it is not specifically task related to the job of fire suppression. So that was kind of the first thing that people were like, hey, we can sue you, or like you're opening up liability to being sued, to having some lawsuits, into this kind of whole pass-fail punitive assessment just going away or not meaning anything, because we can definitively show that it accurately measures fireline tasks. That's the first point. The second point, which is not as fancy or scientific, but it's just the fact that firefighters were like, this 5-minute step test it doesn't match the fire line. We can feel the discrepancy, and this thing it's just not doing what it's intended to do. And that was criticism that was brought up back in the mid 90s, early 90s. And I think this one is really interesting because I've lived this exact situation back at the previous fire department I worked at as an exercise physiologist. This was kind of like this was during COVID. So we went through a period where we weren't seeing anybody. There was no in-person. So once people started coming back and we started doing more in-person assessments and screenings and things like that, we switched from the Gherkin treadmill test, which is a submax treadmill test that measures, there's a formula and it equates your estimated metabolic equivalent, which is kind of like another way of measuring oxygen consumption, essentially. And we switched from that to a 3-minute step test. Very similar to what we're describing here, like you take your recovery heart rate, and that's what we plug into this formula, and that's how we get an estimated number of what your max is, based on your age, your gender, things like that. And we did that for probably a year or so and tested hundreds of firefighters on the 3-minute step test. And we just from what we were testing, we were seeing discrepancies in just the actual numbers. We're like, some of these don't make sense. Like, I know this person's fit and they scored terribly on it, or vice versa. I'm like, this guy is like, I can see his lungs about to explode in his chest, and but he got a good score. I don't know about that. So we started questioning it and looking into it, and then that combined with just a lot of the feedback we were getting, they would get done with the step test 3 minutes and be like, that was it. This is what you're using to see if I can go like work a high rise fire and carry multiple hose packs up 5 flights of stairs and then go fire spread. That's not doing it. That's not measuring it. So we reevaluated and we ended up going back to the Gherkin treadmill test. Even though that formula is not perfect, there's discrepancy in that as well. But I think that brings up another good point about just there is a difference between a submax test and a max test. And I know some of the flaws of the pack test are just the fact that it's, you get done with it. And I mean, for a majority of firefighters, I would say, they're like, okay, well, that's not as hard as fire suppression. Like, that's not anywhere close to how hard the job can be. So how is that, an accurate measurement of my fitness? And how is the pack test saying I'm fit enough to go direct and dig line? And I think that's a super valid question to ask. It was a question I asked the first time I did it, and then actually went out and worked and saw how hard the job was. But you almost have to have these assessments be submax if you're making it punitive, if you're making it pass fail, and you're making it like your job's on the line. Because the risk of going max and actually going like you're testing your VO2 max, testing your highest levels is risky. Like there's just a lot of risk to that. I mean, you not only are you potentially like injuring yourself, but you're affecting operations. Like probably not like recovered enough to go actually do your job right after you do a max test, where if you do a submax test, like you can still get called out and like perform your job just fine. So I think that's important to bring up. Why the pack test is submax, why almost all of these fitness assessments are submax, and why we're not just like max VO2 testing everybody. I know you've got a lot of experience with this stuff too. What are your thoughts, or what do you want to add on that part of this conversation?
So I think the big thing that comes to mind that I want to make the distinction between is a test that measures metabolic cost and a test that measures physiological strain. Simple terms, what is the metabolic demand, the energy requirements to perform a task, and what is the strain that you feel subjectively and objectively as an individual. So you look at the two realms of testing we have going on. You have the pack hike test. You're going to feel some level of strain, but that test doesn't care about that strain. It's not measuring heart rate. It's not measuring RPE. It's simply a metabolic cost experiment for you. Here's based on equations, based on externally validated equations, we're going to set the standard at that 22 milliliters per kilogram per minute of oxygen consumption. We don't need to go into the weeds, but it's just to let you know that is the only marker that this test is looking at, is can you perform that metabolic cost for 45 minutes? It doesn't give a shit about anything else. So when you're doing the pack hike test and you complete it in 45 minutes, it's getting the broader agency level to perspective that we can anticipate that you at least are able to meet that 22.5 for a low to moderate duration. And that is being extrapolated to the, okay, if they can do that, they should be able to perform fire line tasks for long periods of time. And there's inherent flaws within that sentence that, because of new research too, we are not standing on subjectivity anymore, just like word of mouth. We have empirically based evidence to show that the demands do exceed that 22.5 on a regular basis in a variety of scenarios. But at the same time, I don't really think it's that far off. Like, I think there's a fair amount of activities on the fire line that do probably average out to around that 20 to 30. I'm not saying that we're always going at max VO2. This is a very long endurance based occupation. So from like a bang for your buck standpoint, a safety standpoint, and like Austin said, just not having to go through the undue risk of maxing people out, you can get a lot from that general insight. If you can perform this for 45 minutes, I can assume that your VO2 max is at X level. That number is typically seen as 45 to 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute in firefighting occupations. And that's just because if we have that ceiling, if we're working at 50% of it, we can probably go for a long ass time. So that's where you should at least be at that ceiling here at that 45 or 50. So that 22.5 is not hard. So when you look at how that pack hike test feels for some of you, if you're blown out redlining that whole time and it takes you 30 minutes to recover, it's probably an indicator that your fitness is not where it needs to be for the demands of wildland firefighting as a whole. But that's the pro of it is all the things I just mentioned. It's scalable, it's safe, it's repeatable, it's standardized. It's not this like random subjective test that I can maybe throw in to just a singular crew. It's one that can be distributed across tens of thousands of personnel. So it's good at what it does. It's good for getting that baseline level of metabolic cost that does mimic the demands of wildland firefighting to a large degree. So I have zero qualms with that. I think when I first got into this and I was like a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed college student thinking, not logistically at all. Before I got into the field of wildland firefighting and realized all the constraints, all the red tape, all the bureaucracy, all the agency limitations, I was thinking, this is fucking stupid. Why don't they just do something else? And then I started to realize that implementing a change is not as easy as just random one person with all the ideas in the world being like, this would be cool. So I think it's like healthy to have that relationship to think what's being missed. But at the same time, this test is great for what it does. It serves the purpose that it needs to.
Yeah, I agree. It is really good for what it is intended to be. And I think a lot of the critiques on the pack test and a lot of the negative talks about it are coming from a place of like, you're almost making the pack test into something that it's not. And so I think if you just, you stay constrained to like what it actually is, it actually makes a ton of sense. And I was the same as you. I was like, this test is dumb. But then, you think about it, you kind of step out of that and you dig into like papers like this and a lot of the stuff going back to the mid 90s where it's explaining why they were, why they're going away from the step test, why they were looking to create a whole new test and not just like a supplementary one. But you see like that 22.5 number keeps coming up and this was back in the 60s and 70s. That was the number that was first kind of popping up everywhere. And then Brian Sharkey specifically, we gotta find where he is and get him on the podcast, by the way, because that would be cool to hear all this from him. But he did a lot of different tests. It wasn't just like, hey, let's just, I have this idea for a pack test, 45 minutes, 3 miles, 40 pounds, whatever, and let's just try it and see what happens. They tested multiple different things, including retesting the 5-minute step test and just seeing what happened. And from what I've read, everything they kind of see like that 45 minutes, that 3 miles, like what the pack test is as we do it today, kind of came right out to that 22.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute of oxygen consumption. And that just aligned with what the research said, like this is your mean oxygen consumption for the fire line. And still there's been research after the mid 90s that still confirm this. One of my favorite studies, I've talked about it already on this podcast, is Joe Soul's Metabolic Demands of Hiking. And in that study, I want to say it was hotshot crews and type 2 hand crews, measured them on all kinds of different hikes, training hikes, ingress, egress on incidents. They kind of had all these different categories. One of the categories was just purely uphill hiking. So kind of just put all of the time spent uphill and put that into one category, and had the kind of the mean oxygen consumption for all of those different categories and the ranges. So the peak versus the very bottom of each one. And if you look at the mean oxygen consumption on these hikes, they're all kind of right there in that low to mid 20s. So it shows like if you're looking at means, if you're trying to extrapolate over the entire job, you are kind of right there. And again, you mentioned this, but I think it's worth repeating. This is purely oxygen consumption. So this is kind of just one aspect of just all the different types of demands that are placed on the body. But I want to go back to the discrepancy part that we were talking about, mean versus peak, because I think that's where a lot of this conversation ends up going, or it starts out there, because everyone's like, pack test is dumb, the job's way harder. I've said that a million times. Everyone says that. I want to give a shout out to Brian Sharkey, even though he's probably not listening to this, but he had, even this paper, or kind of in his his review that he wrote once the pack test became like the official test. He says, even highly trained and motivated workers are unable to sustain more than 50% of their capacity during extended work shifts. A worker's aerobic fitness needs to be at least 2 times the energy demands of the job. So at least 2 times 22.5 was put you right at 45, which you already mentioned is kind of right where a lot of those peaks are. And Joe Soul found pretty much the same thing. I forget the exact number, but on all of the uphill hiking, the peak oxygen consumption for that was like 42 point something, if I remember correctly. So the recommendation has always been like, yeah, you should be able to do way more than the pack test. The pack test is kind of like your minimum baseline based on the mean of all of these different fireline tasks: hiking, going direct, all of your high intensity tasks, all of your moderate to low intensity tasks. Put it all into one big pot. And this is what you should be able to not only hit, but like sustain, for 45 minutes instead of just 5 minutes, which I think is also an important revelation from going from step test to pack test. Is like, I mean, we just increased the time of the fitness assessment by whatever, I can't do math, 15 times of what it used to be. And that's a big jump if you really just look at it from like a very objective standpoint. So I feel like we need to also acknowledge that Brian Sharkey himself said like you should be able to do twice as much. Like, we're not saying like you should only be able to do what the pack test is testing you. And then I was just thinking about this one last thing, and I'll let you hop in with your thoughts. Dr. Brand Ruby studied this too, and he studied male versus female, and I forget what the female one is, but I remember peak oxygen consumption for the males was like 53.5, which is, I mean, that's significantly higher than 45. That's a big jump from even there. And the equivalent, just so to help people understand what that number looks like, the equivalent of a 53.5 VO2 max to a mile and a half run time would be a 9-minute, 9-second mile and a half, which is flying. Like, I've never ran a mile and a half that fast, and I'm not slow, but that's flying. So we're talking, yes, there is a big discrepancy between peak and mean, but that doesn't mean that the mean, I don't know why that's funny to me. That doesn't mean that the mean is like something we should just dismiss and that we should only focus on the peak. So we'll get into the peak a little bit more next episode, because I want to talk about why the type 1 fitness test that I created is a little bit more directed at that. But what's your input on kind of like that discrepancy that we see?
So the discrepancy we're talking about is the upper end of the demands in wildland firefighting and the mismatch between the pack hike test and those demands. And the thing that truly sparked the thought in my mind of why I needed to research this topic is from a story from a friend who, I didn't know anything about wildland firefighting at this time. I had just started my master's degree. I was looking for things that I could plug into a population that needed something extra, a field of research that had gaps that needed to be filled. And this story is really what solidified in my mind where I needed to plug in. So my buddy goes on, he gets a detail with a hotshot crew. He's been on a couple different type 2 crews. He's worked his way up from like just a 18-year-old, no idea what's going on, to like pretty established member on a type 2 crew. And he gets that chance to go detail on with a local hotshot crew, and he gets an HRI within like 2 days. Has to leave the fire line to go to the hospital. And he was fit. He was on a good type 2 crew, had adequate fitness, and the demands that he saw were just heinous. Like,
For the listeners,
110 plus
explain quickly what a HR.
heat-related illness. So
Yeah.
when we talked about metabolic cost and physiological strain, the physiological strain has a lot more to do with that HRI, the heat-related illness. So when we talk about things of the step test, we're eliciting some kind of physiological strain to see how you can accommodate it, because people with much greater cardiovascular system resilience are going to have a way less tendency towards an HRI for many reasons. Heart rate's not going to go as high. They're much more efficient at producing energy with less blood flow. They're also way better at dissipating heat. They're just thermoregulatory beasts. They can sustain workloads at high rates for long periods of time, and they also utilize more efficient energy substrates. They utilize way less glycogen, way less carbs, way less fuel sources that are going to get tapped quickly. They're just more efficient humans. People with greater cardiorespiratory fitness in the elite category, there's a reason why they can run 2 hour marathons. That doesn't happen by accident. That is like 0% of the population is going to do that without all these systems being tapped into in a very systematic way. So if you tried to just go out and run a marathon at the pace that it would take for a 2 hour marathon, you're going to be blown out in 5 minutes for most people. Like most people can't even run that fast in general.
I
You
was
ever
gonna
seen
say
it?
most people can't do
It's
400 meters
yeah,
one
like
lap
a
around the
hundred.
track
It
at
would be
that
tough
pace.
for like a 400-meter dash to hold that pace for most, and that
Yeah,
is like a lot of factors. But it's in the same way that if you go in to a field like wildland firefighting and you have to accommodate 115-degree temps, massive steep hikes, you're not getting sent in as a hotshot crew unless it's fucked up. Like that is just the bare like it's that's always kind of what's been on my mind is like you're not going to go anywhere unless it's absolutely just a messed up scenario and they need to make sure that you're safe. You're not a liability. And that is the big theme of where the assessment is truly lacking and you see it. You see it all the time when you get contract crews, type 2 crews that are unfit and they get put in the same boat as a hotshot crew. That standard is just much more like right in front of your eyes and sometimes you just find yourself looking around like, why are you out here? What are you out here for? Just to not die? Just to not have a heat related illness? Like you're trying to survive out here instead of putting work down. And that's like the bigger theme for like me as a researcher from the previous history is just this shouldn't be happening. Like how could that have happened? How could you not put people in a scenario to be safe? And of course, like there's a lot of factors that impose, I don't know, against this of being able to like every single scenario is different. Tons of factors can result in somebody getting an HRI. But the simple fact that the pack hike test is the only differentiator between somebody who can and can't go into any of the demand scene is preposterous to me. And the fact that more incidents don't happen is kind of mind blowing. But that's the discrepancy, broad scopes that drew my interest to this field is the fact that any person who passes this test could go in and be in the same place that my friend was in and have harsher consequences. Heart attacks, HRIs, every one of these types of scenarios can impose those kinds of scenarios on people with a lack of fitness. It's not uncommon to assume that a 40-year-old without fitness out there in that kind of environment would succumb to those fates. So that's my like very serious take on this, why there needs to be a higher threshold test to delineate between who should be put in what circumstances and be placed under those kinds of, I don't know, scenarios in a safe way. That's kind of what like drew my interest at first. So when you think about physiological cost, what could cause somebody to be in a really, I don't know, harmful scenario? Steeper terrain, heavy load carriage, fatigue, poor, did I already say sleep restriction, sleep deprivation, food from MREs or a shitty caterer,
high altitude,
high altitude,
smoke inhalation. Yeah,
psychological strain from your crew dynamics. When you just think about all of these factors that elicit stress on individuals out here, it's like one of the most just the allostatic load is kind of the term that we talk about. Just the overall stress that your body goes through is unmatched on a regular basis. This is like going into a tactical military operation mission for 2 weeks at a time, nonstop for 6 months or more, 9 months sometimes, every single year. So imagine being deployed for like that amount of stress just every single year, year in and year out. Bigger theme, we need a resilient workforce. So you can't just look at the like cardiovascular strain, cardiovascular fitness. You need to have so many tools to accommodate all those stresses. You need to be dialed as fuck. You need to have great fueling strategies, great hydration strategies, great mindfulness and stress regulation strategies. This isn't like a woo-woo thing. This is like you need to be the most resilient person on the planet to do this job and not let it take that toll on you. And of course, people do it. People do none of those things and still do the job for 30 years. But you see what happens. You see those salty 50-year-olds with shitty joints, shitty relationships, and like just the job's going to take the toll. Like I have an unmatched amount of empathy for everybody in this field because no shit. Like, why wouldn't your life be so fucking hard doing this? So that's kind of the bigger existential theme of like, look at all the stress that you're imposed on. We need to have better tests that can identify best practices and how individuals can ultimately become more resilient to stress overall in this field, not just physical.
yeah. You made a point kind of at the beginning there that I want to talk about, and I mean, I think your overall main point was like, we need to be we need to make sure that individuals can safely reach those higher peak levels that we know they're going to reach at some point on the job when they're on the fire line. I have a different opinion. This is not my opinion, but this is an opinion of someone else who wrote a blog article. And the title of this blog article is it time to reassess the work capacity test? So when I saw that headline, that caught my eye because I'm like, be curious to hear what they say because I have my own thoughts. That's why we're having this whole podcast episode. And it did not go how I thought it was going to go. So I'm just going to read through some of the points, some of the sentences in this article, or I should say blog post, this opinion piece, because they're kind of going against what you just said. So I'll read through some of this and hear your thoughts. I'll share my thoughts too. But let's read it. Is it time to reassess the work capacity test? Since 1988, the work capacity test has resulted in numerous injuries and 18 documented deaths. Yeah, I was not expecting that when I opened this one. Next sentence. Some people thrive on this test. People with strong shins, I think is what they're referring to. Others suffer severely for days or months afterwards. Some will die on it. And it keeps going. It gives all the bullet point list of medical symptoms that veteran firefighters, sawyers, supervisors, crew bosses all experience. Well, first bullet point is excruciating shin pain, which I love that was the first bullet point because that is an undeniable fact. It is excruciating, but it keeps going and gives like profuse sweating, difficulty breathing, severe chest pain, dizziness. Difficulty breathing is on there twice, so that must be really serious. And then after all the bullet points, it says, despite pain that screams for them to stop, firefighters push themselves beyond what they know is healthy. If they stop, they failed the test. And it keeps going, brings up rhabdo, keeps going, compartment syndrome, basically all like the worst possible injuries that anyone can ever experience. And then if it concludes with this sentence, a test should never risk a person's health and especially never take a life. It is time to reassess how we determine a person's ability to fight wildland fires. And then it lists out all of the fatalities that occurred over the last couple decades from taking the PAC test. And I will say, before I get your thoughts, almost every single one of these is a heart attack. So I think that's important context. But what do you think? Do you think we should reassess the PAC test because people have died taking it? Do you think that's a legit argument or not?
So before I get into this, no disrespect to any of the individuals who ever succumbed to this test. I don't mean to seem like, I don't know, any kind of level of disrespect towards those individuals, but the stance that individuals should not have this kind of stress imposed on them prior to wildland firefighting is preposterous and the exact opposite reason of why we should have, I don't know. I just think it's looking at it from a lens that's extremely flawed in the fact that if you know the demands are at least 22.5 and this test is 22.5, how on earth are you going to get around the fact that that demand is going to be placed on you during the job? And what we're already telling you is the demands are higher. Uphill hiking peak, 45. What do you think would have happened to those individuals with the heart attacks in the pack hike test if they did that uphill hiking bout that pushed to a level that was double what they were capable of doing? That heart attacks aren't just a random coincidence in scenarios like this. This is like all built up surrounding the context of that individual. It's not a matter of if, but when. And the bigger existential crisis that I face with this field is the fact that we don't do any screening. We don't have any way of correcting or getting ahead or being preventative with the cardiovascular strain that's imposed on folks and what the heart truly looks like. How big of a risk are people at, or how big of a risk are they for these heart attacks? And that's one thing that, Austin, I'm sure you have experience with this. That's one thing that within my job as an exercise physiologist, I'm not a cardiologist. I'm not there to detect exactly what's going on. But one thing that we do with every single firefighter that goes through our program is do a graded exercise test hooked up to an EKG, and we push them to a submax, 85% of their heart rate max, or 100% for a maximal test. And we see what happens to the cardiovascular system. What does their blood pressure look like? What does the heart rate increase look like? What does the EKG look like? And between all those factors, we give handfuls of firefighters very useful feedback when they're 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. As they keep climbing the ladder, now they have a baseline of what their cardiovascular system's doing through their whole career span, and they can get ahead of the game. So this isn't a knock on those individuals. It's not a knock on like the pack hike test. It's just the fact that we don't have any kind of other resources to put people in an optimal position to protect against heart attacks in this field. And that's a flaw in itself. There's no blood work, there's no EKG assessment, there's no practitioner, no consultations, there's no feedback. It's just here, go do this cost, make sure you can do it, and then we'll put you out in wildland firefighting, and we're going to do that every single year without actually treating the person. So that's the bigger issue with this whole argument of, I agree, I don't think we should send people into the pack hike test without preparation. We don't even do a PAR Q. You don't even get a fucking questionnaire about your health history before you go do the pack hike test. What if you have left bundle branch block? What if you've had a history of an MI? What if you have family history? What if you smoke? Like all these other things that you could actually utilize to see, you know what, man, you probably shouldn't be in this field. Like, this is an endurance performance job, and if you have a ton of underlying conditions that prevent you from doing it, you're right. You shouldn't be in the pack hike test conversation anyways. So that's my take. I think there's a lot of work that could be done preemptively on the test to eliminate scenarios like heart attacks during it. But at the same time, I have zero doubt that those individuals would have been those demands would have been imposed on them in greater amounts during the season. And that sucks to say because they should have been selectively screened out from the job prior to the start.
Yeah, I think that's when you're thinking about this opinion specifically, and like you said, that I bring this up in no way to disrespect these individuals or even the author of this blog, but I think this opinion is dangerous, and it's looking at the problem with the complete wrong solution. The solution, if you make the pack test easier or reduce it or make something that doesn't hit that 22.5, you're increasing the risk. Like the chances of someone who does have an injury or a cardiac event during the pack test, if they get through that initial assessment and then get out on the fire line, but they're not physically ready, now you are putting them at that much more risk and everyone else around them. Because if there is an incident now, that has to now be prioritized, and depending on the context of the situation, now you're increasing the risk for everyone else that's involved. So I think this is dangerous. It's dangerous to have this idea anytime you're lowering the bar, especially when we're talking about assessing cardiovascular health, since that is the number one cause of death, firefighters all over the country. You have to take this stuff seriously. You gave a great example of, actually measuring people's hearts with EKGs. That's something that we did at my old department too. So before we would do their step test or Gherkin treadmill test, we would do a standing EKG or a resting EKG. With certain people, we would do a full treadmill EKG to get kind of their more accurate full max like MET score and get their EKG when they were doing that. So we could have our physicians look at it. And it was rare, but there were a few times where like we would put someone through that test and our physician would look at the thing and be like, I don't feel comfortable with you being on an engine right now. Like one call and one thing that you get sent in to do could be like the last thing you do based on what I'm seeing here, with what your heart's showing me. So it is a serious thing. I wanted to bring this up also because I wanted to talk real quick about like some flaws of the pack test. But I don't think this is one of the flaws. I think the fact that it is so specific to just one demand, and it doesn't really take into account muscular strength, doesn't really take into account any kind of like, again, higher demand. I think those are some flaws and some reasons why I designed the type 1 fitness test the way that I designed it, because I wanted to add a leg strength component. I wanted to add a grip strength component. I wanted to add more of a pure aerobic capacity component. So, there are some things that are, I think, missing from the pack test that are really important for health and performance on this job, and I think should be part of an assessment. So we'll talk about that in the next episode. We'll go deep into that, I'm sure. But real quick, any kind of flaws that we haven't talked about yet from your end?
So the last thing that I have for you all is kind of a breakdown of how I can objectively assess the pack hike test in terms of its validity. And validity is essentially just meaning, is the test measuring what it's supposed to? Is it serving the purpose that it's intended to? And other than just having a random opinion, you can do this by breaking it down into all the different kinds of validity that exist and categorize an assessment. And the first one that I have for the pack hike test is construct validity. Does it measure the underlying quality that we're looking at? And I would say it's moderate. It's assessing metabolic demand, your ability to obtain that metabolic demand and accommodate it. But of course, the relative variability in how that pack hike test looks for you, it's flawed to a degree because somebody who's sucking wind, dying versus excelling, there's no way to differentiate. Now, next set, does it predict a real world outcome or can it predict future performance? Way better than the step test for sure. You get the pack on, you're walking, muscular endurance is involved. I would say it's moderate in that regard too. It can predict future performance in the job to a degree, at least to a much larger degree than the step test. Concurrent validity, does it agree with another accepted measure? There's a lot of crossover between the VO2 max values of wildland firefighting and the VO2 level that we're observing here in the pack hike test, and the relationship between those who have that standard VO2 that they should be at and where they're at on the pack hike test. I think it does. There's a lot of coordination between the two. It's been validated with all the research that Austin's pointed out between Sharkey, Ruby, and Joe Sol, everybody in between there. So I would say yes, it's moderate. Content validity at face value, does it mimic the job? If you look at it, does it look like the job? Moderate as well. I don't have any of these in like a super high range, but I'd say all those being moderate for the scalability, the reliability, the practicality, which are very high. Like that's a good bang for your buck assessment because of what its means of executing are. It's for 40 plus thousand personnel. It's for a safe test. It's for something that can be executed the exact same way each time and get the same pass-fail result. Like it's got really high standards for me in terms of the reliability and practicality. So I think it's a pretty damn good test. Honestly, I hit moderate in a lot of levels and super high in those last couple. But I think what we're going to get to in this next episode is where we can go from there and what can serve as a supplement for where this test is lacking.
Yeah, and one that doesn't destroy your shins.
Yeah, where you don't have to awkwardly perform a task any longer for those of you who hate it just as much as we do.
But like we said, just to reiterate, for what it is, for what the pack test was intended for, I do think it checks all the boxes, and it is a good baseline measure. We're talking like it's the bar, it's the entry level standard, fitness standard. So that's what that is. If you try to make it anything more than the lowest level entry fitness standard, you're going to be extremely disappointed, and you're going to have wrecked shins. So it's going to be a double negative that you're dealing with. So yeah, I'm excited for this next episode. I want to go deeper into the different types of validity and why we should also apply those to other supplementary tests like the type 1 fitness test and others as well that you can maybe kind of more accurately measure certain aspects of physical qualities, for example like anaerobic threshold or muscular endurance for a specific part of the body. And so you can kind of look at fitness in more detailed ways, which I think is important to find kind of like where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are. And that's going to, the more information you can get on all that stuff, the better you're going to be able to know where you're at. And then once you know where you're at with more information, more detail, you can know what to do with that information. You can design a better plan that's going to be more effective, and you can improve those weaknesses. And we can go into this next episode too, but go through our whole assessment process and why we test all the different things that we test, why we test so many things, because we do a lot of testing, especially in that first week when we work with someone, and then what we do with that information. We don't just do it to make your week suck and test a bunch of things. There's a lot of reasons behind it. So we'll get into that next episode. Super, super pumped. Looking forward to that one. It's going to be good. It's going to be a long one. So start getting ready for that now. I already got a bunch of notes, but that was good, man. Good talk. But yeah, we'll catch everyone